Okay, thank you everyone for being back on time. I know it's very tempting when you have the opportunity to network with your colleagues to catch up and share stories and hopefully exchange lots of good ideas as well, because these days are a great opportunity for that as well. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Jane Torr. She's a professor associated with Macquarie University. One of the first conversations I had with Jane, she started talking about how picture books worked, and I thought, ooh, there's a whole story here. I can't wait to learn more. So I'm sure you're going to find her presentation very interesting.
Thank you very much, Miley, and good morning and welcome. As Miley said, today I'd like to talk about the central role played by children's literature as a pathway to learning to read. I'd like to begin by stating the key ideas that underpin this presentation. I believe that children's lives are enriched by literature. Picture books enhance young children's understanding of themselves and other people and the world they live in. They expose children to outstanding visual and verbal artwork. Just as important, they provide entertainment and stimulate children's imaginations. Children learn to read by being read to, frequently, starting when they're babies. Children's oral language development is therefore central to their emerging understanding of written language and how it conveys meaning. Research has shown that the amount and the diversity of the words children use and understand prior to school age is associated with their later academic achievement. Libraries have the potential to provide children with the types of experiences that will nurture in them a lifelong love of books and reading. So today I'd like to talk about these topics. First of all, to talk about emergent literacy, then to move on to looking at how children's literature provides a pathway for reading. I'll then like to spend a bit of time talking about choosing books for early literacy sessions at the library and focus specifically on books and reading with babies and toddlers, because they're often a little bit different things involved than reading with older preschoolers. And finally, to talk about some of the things like how you encourage participation in the library and ways of managing groups of young children together while you're reading. So let's start just by thinking about what emergent literacy means and what it is. And Amelia touched on this earlier. So the term emergent literacy refers to, quote, the skills, knowledge and attitudes that are developmental precursors to later conventional reading and writing. So it's what children know about reading and writing before they ever start school. They learn it informally, they learn it just through everyday interactions and through sharing books with adults. And in many ways, these predict what children know about reading when they make the transition to school. Now, children are actually immersed in books and writing from the time they are born, really. We're all surrounded by books, words, pictures, environmental print. And the key thing about them is that they're learnt informally without explicit instruction, formal instruction. And as Amelia pointed out earlier, that there are we can think of emergent literacy as two different types of processes that are involved when children learn these early, this knowledge and skills about reading prior to school. And those two different types of processes are the decoding processes and comprehending processes. And I should say mainly decoding and mainly comprehending because they interact all the time. with one informing the other. So let's have a look again at the decoding processes. And the decoding processes link to the literature review that Amelia mentioned, section 4, and also the framework section that you have in your framework today. And each of these types of decoding processes link to a section, a table in the framework. So yes, the phonological awareness, that understanding that the words we speak are made up of smaller speech sounds called phonemes. First of all, children can learn, well, they get a sense that there are different syllables and you can break words up into syllables like holiday, holiday. They can clap it as they get a little bit older. And then they start to realise that actually spoken words are made up of individual speech sounds. And when children can start to rhyme, they make up rhymes, silly rhymes, or cat, mat, hat, sat, they're demonstrating an understanding that words, spoken words, are made up of speech sounds. So that's one thing. And then alphabet and letter knowledge. This is when children, often from a very young age, get the idea that the black squiggles, the marks, are important to adults, they mean something, and gradually they learn that particular parts of those particular marks relate to a speech sound. In other words, that letters represent speech sounds. And then finally, in decoding, as Amelia said, that there's concepts of print, which is that sense of how books work, how you handle books, you orient them, the cover is at the front, that the print and pictures convey meanings in different kinds of ways, and you need to look at each of them. So you're looking at pictures as you're hearing the verbal text read to you. So comprehending processes. Again, we've organised this according to 3 types of knowing. And again, this links to the framework, section 4 of your framework. So oral language and vocabulary, and that's the number of words and the type of words that a child understands or produces. And another important aspect of oral language and vocabulary is using decontextualised language. And that is language when you're talking about something that isn't in the immediate environment. Objects, actions, people. And sometimes it starts with something as simple as a child normally seeing Teddy sitting in a certain place. And gradually, when they see that, they may name Teddy. And then one day, the teddy bear won't be there. And they'll say, "Where's Teddy?" And it's as if the word has become pulled out or decontextualised. It's not, you're referring to things that aren't in your immediate visual environment. And that's a key aspect of reading written text, that you have to be able to understand words and knowledge and grammar when it's not something that's in the immediate environment. And again, oral language and vocabulary, the ability to make causal connections between one event and another. And we'll talk about this a bit more in interpreting and understanding the meanings in picture books, especially narratives, as they unfold. And finally, and very important again, is the familiarity with different types of texts, because they use language differently. And as children get to the preschool years and then make the transition into school, they need to be able to understand how factual texts are expressed, the words, the grammar that's associated with that, as opposed to narratives and made-up stories. And they gradually become able to distinguish this especially when they have lots of opportunity to be read and talked to and read and listen to different kinds of texts. Okay, background knowledge is so important that children draw on their own personal experiences and their experiences with other texts, with TV, with computer games. They bring all of that knowledge to bear when they're understanding and interpreting and comprehending a picture book or a story. And then finally, the print motivation, which again is a child who has learnt to love books and love reading, have the persistence to undertake that very complex process of eventually learning to read and write in conventional terms. They'll sense this is really worth it. Okay, now we're talking about these different emergent knowledge and skills as if they are separate, which they are in one way, and it's helpful, I think, to think about it that way. But in point of fact, skilled and fluent readers are able to put it all together. So the knowledge, skills and attitudes that are required to become a skilled and fluent reader, I believe, are beautifully captured in this metaphor of a rope. There are the two different but related types of learning involved: the comprehending processes, the decoding processes, and all the strands that are part of, gradually are a function of these two kinds of processes, and how they all come together and gradually become more and more fluent and more strategic over time. Now, sometimes in childcare centres, especially with preschoolers, staff are beginning to use explicit phonics programs like Letterland and Jolly Phonics and so forth. They are, once children get to school, yes, they definitely need systematic, explicit teaching of letter sound relationships. Apparently, sometimes parents want their child to start learning these decoding processes in the last year before they start school. The evidence suggests, and Amelia actually touched on it a little bit too in terms of library sessions, that in a way it's more effective and gives children a much greater sense of words and pictures and how they all go together, to focus on building the comprehending skills, the background knowledge skills. And yes, print will be noticed as that's happening and can be talked about in the teachable moment. But it's very big call to expect young children prior to school age to be able to make that very decontextualised, explicit link through direct instruction needed to be able to do alphabet knowledge and decoding in that explicit way. So let's have a look at why the vocabulary and background knowledge is so central to reading comprehension. According to Snow, one of the most robust long-term indicators of good literacy outcomes that can be measured in early childhood is vocabulary. And that's partly because learning a word involves learning a concept, gaining information, knowledge and facts about the world, making interconnections with other words and concepts, and then understanding the relationship between how you build words from the core meaning of a word, from the root part of the word. And when a child learns a new word, they are, in that sense, also both drawing on background knowledge and building background knowledge as they learn and build their vocabulary. They also start to learn how words are related to each other grammatically, because you don't learn a new word in isolation ever. you learn it in a context. So just to give you a couple of examples from some research I've done, to show how learning new words can just naturally flow and unfold when reading with young children. So this picture of a bear in a cave, it's quite an abstract picture in a way. And in a study, we looked at how 24 young children, 4-year-olds, read books just naturally with a preschool teacher or their mother, and what they said about the pictures and what the adults said about the pictures. So here the child noticed those little lines, the little dots there, and said, that's where you cut it out. You know, they've noticed that about that. So that's an example of how they begin to engage in sort of the early kinds of decoding of what symbols mean in that sense. But here you can see that when they were looking at this page, the educator said, there's a special thing that some animals do called hibernating, where they sleep all winter long and then in the springtime they wake up. There's a few animals that hibernate. And Sam, the child, just continued to scrutinise the picture for quite some time. And so the educator says, and that's where bears sleep all winter. They don't come out at all. Did you know that? And Sam says, never? No, not in the winter time. That's called hibernation. And Sam, well, when do they come out? And she says, springtime. Now, the word hibernate doesn't actually appear in the verbal text of that book, but the educator introduces what is a scientific term 3 times, and she juxtaposes it with the more common word sleep to explain its meaning. And she then adds this background information about hibernating animals. Thus, she's building Sam's background knowledge as well. She also uses a mental process term. Did you know that? Which is seeing Sam as one who knows, thinks, can understand. So already they're starting to develop the idea that books can be talked about, pictures can be talked about. And she is encouraging him to make visible his own thinking and to participate in the conversation. Here's another example where the child, Alexandra, has noticed a fairly, inscrutable use of lines which we as adult readers understand to be the reflections of either the moon or the sun on the water. So Alexandra's been looking at this picture and she sees the curved lines and she says, what's that? The educator says, I think it's the sun setting maybe. Alexandra, yeah, because I think those things go along the sun. Yeah, it's a reflection, isn't it? So she's seen drawings of the sun with the rays coming out, which is, pretty common. And she's making a sort of an interpretation, building on her previous knowledge of texts, of pictures, and how pictures mean as well as words can mean. The word reflection is slightly more technical term. And again, we have the mental processes of thinking, and Alexandra and her educator are talking about pictures and interpreting them together. And just one more example from this study. Here's again how building vocabulary and background knowledge are so intertwined, they're hard to tease apart at times. So here we've got Karen and her educator are looking at this picture of the steam train in a book called The Baby Who Wouldn't Go to Bed. So Karen sees the lumps of coal in that first carriage there and she says, are they rocks? And the mother here says, coal. Karen, where's coal? And the mother gives a classic definition here, the exact wording. Coal is what trains carry sometimes, and they burn coal to get energy to make the train move. And then they get on with the story. So it's sort of like the teachable moment idea, building background knowledge to work with children to interpret the visual images, and they're through picture books, through looking at and talking about picture books. So just to make a brief point, I know that's quite a lot to read there, but the point it's making is that there's a very strong connection between the number of words a child hears and knows and the social background and education and socioeconomic status of their families. So what the amount of vocabulary a child knows is really an index of much, much more than just knowing words. And here where it says at the bottom of that quote that some early childhood programs do provide the kinds of engaging and language-rich experiences that can foster and build that kind of background knowledge, but not all do. And recently I've been involved in a project looking at the language environment of children under 2 years of age in long daycare centres. And I was quite surprised to realise that of some 60 children in long daycare centres, fewer than half of those had any book-focused interactions at all. So again, we can't assume that a child who comes to a library session, even if they do go to other contexts like early childhood education and care centres, has necessarily had the kinds of experiences that the library staff will provide in their story times. So let's now move on and look a bit more closely at children's literature and why I think of it as a pathway to reading. So children's literature, as it says there, teaches far, far more than literacy. However, that's what we're focusing on today. Children learn to read by being read to, and this was recently demonstrated through this longitudinal study of some 2,369 Australian children, and it found a relationship between the frequency of parent-child book reading at 21 and 34 months of age and children's vocabulary at 58 months of age. So there's a statistical predictive relationship there. Other research has found similar things as well, but this was particularly interesting because it's an Australian study. They also found, these authors, that the 11 minutes of reading a day to a baby under 2 at those ages is the minimum to be able to start getting some kinds of associations with vocabulary. So let's just look at what a picture book is. Picture books use a mixture of words and pictures to create their text. So the pictures aren't just decorative, as Johnston says. They're part of the story. They are telling the story. And if you just have one without the other, the story is incomplete, the narrative is incomplete. And Margaret Meek, way back in 1988, and this is one of my favourite books, she explains how quality picture books in and of themselves provide subtle lessons about words and pictures and reading, just through the way they are laid out, the way the words, the print and the pictures move through the book. And I've got a couple of examples here. But just before we get to that, so in a picture book, the pictures, as you turn from one page to the next, the child has to fill in that gap through their own imagination. They also need to infer that what has happened here and what has happened there, they have to use their reasoning skills to understand that. And you may have noticed that very young children, if you see a narrative unfolding and there's a dog on each page, may raise the idea that there are lots of different dogs there. Gradually, they start to learn, no, pictures represent movement through time. Narrative picture books represent movement through time. And so they start to learn how the pictures and the verbal text relate to each other. And each reading of a picture book lets the child know that the text remains constant, but each reading of good picture books also reveals something new. So thinking about that in terms of the library context, you might choose to read a book, and some of the children will have already heard it and we're familiar with it, but you might, through another reading in another voice by someone with different, expression, and another opportunity to look at the pictures, they will see something new. And pictures in picture books, again, the good ones, there's something there for to invite study and scrutiny. And children often notice things that adults don't notice, and they read pictures in ways that are often very, very interesting and entertaining because they're coming to the text, even if it's one they're familiar with. Each time they come to it, they might notice something new. So let's just have a look at that interaction between visual and verbal texts in a picture book. This one called Snail Trail by Ruth Brown. I have not all the pages here, so I'll just move through them so you can have a look at it. Oh, yeah. First of all, this is the verbal text. This is the written text. These are the words of the whole book. So you can see there it's just 3 sentences long. It describes a journey through space and time. And you'll see when we get to it, it ends with a sleep. Many, many books for children end with a sleep. Also, as Slimy Snail moves through the different types of landscape, each is described in terms of its qualities. So we've got words like steep, gloomy, quiet, high, slippery, narrow, pretty, and dark. So that, if we just had the words, okay, there's something there. Now let's look at the actual visual images. So Slimy Snail sets out on a trail one bright and sunny morning. Now notice where we are visually in relation to the snail. We're right down next to the snail. And the snail has, and we'll see as we go through, it actually has expressions on its snail face. So up a hill, it was very steep. Through a tunnel, very gloomy. Into a forest, very quiet. Over a bridge, very high. Down a slope, very slippery. Up to an arch, very narrow. And then he moves into the cave and goes to sleep, which I haven't put the picture up there. We saw it before. I think, oh no, sorry, there it is. Into a dark, dark cave. He curled up in his shell, very small, and went to sleep. And then we come to the last page. And we then get a whole new perspective on this. So the pictures have added depth and richness to this story. We saw the snail from the visual perspective of a very small child. The snail's face has revealed different emotions as he's moved through his journey. And then the final page reveals to us the snail's journey from an entirely different standpoint. And children can muse over this, we can talk over this, we can trace the snail's trail, and we realise that what was a huge, big world to the snail is actually a small space in our human terms, and that the way that, so it's like an extended metaphor in a way of that journey and what it meant. So in a way, so picture books, as I said before, expose children, give children experience with two kinds of art, if you like. There's the verbal art through the literary language, and that exposure to patterned language, literary language with rhyme and repetition, alliteration, onomatopoeia and poetic effects, imagery, metaphor, and of course, unusual vocabulary. The visual art in picture books offers children opportunities to see some of the high quality artwork by very esteemed artists, and opportunities to develop their aesthetic development. And that's something, in my research anyway, you often don't hear adults and children talking about, is the aesthetics, the colours, the way a painting or a picture in a picture book makes them feel. Yet that is also part of developing their appreciation of texts and books and pictures and images. They also, of course, see cultural and other information through the setting. In pictures, you often see that so much more is being conveyed of the setting, the time, the place, the culture. Not upfront, but it's there. And also how to read pictures, like we saw before, how the whoosh marks that you get in many picture books, and the attitude to take towards your subject, and also how to respond emotionally. All of these are a part and parcel of picture books, even for very, very young children and babies. Good picture books. So, talking about words and pictures assists children in comprehension. Here's a 20-month-old child in a group. This was from a long daycare centre, which I know is different to the library story sharing context. But the teacher was reading Maisie's plane. And the teacher had got this book because the 20-month-old child kept, every time a plane flew over, he'd say, plane, plane. So she thought, okay, let's build on this. She went and found this book and she was reading it to him. She draws attention to the bird and they plot the bird throughout, even though the words aren't about the bird. But it's encouraging the child to look through at the picture as a whole, as well as parts of the picture. But the point really of interest at the moment is that trajectory of the plane's movement. With her finger, she demonstrated that and went off the page and kept going upwards. So she was teaching the child, again, how you look at pictures and make meaning from them, often meaning that's symbolic in nature. So it's assisting in comprehension, but also in very early ideas that you need to decode print, that it's a symbolic representation. Here's one of reading Snail Trail. This was a teacher reading to a group of toddlers. And so she starts by inviting prediction. What will he find? I don't know. Let's turn the page. Oh, careful, Snail, doing some balancing across the bridge. Can you see his eyes? He's a bit upside down there. Shung! And again with her arms, she and her gestures, she explains why he looks different on that page to that page. So I'd like to now move on to talk a little bit about choosing books for early literacy sessions at the library. And please, these are just general principles because you will know best your families and communities. So these are, as I say, just general principles, things we can think about when we're choosing books for children. So the first point is, do the books address themes that are significant to very young children, like friendship and getting lost, sharing, birth of a sibling, dealing with fears and worries? Now, in the research I've done, the books that assist with that, like, for example, What is a Friend? And I love this one because of the expression on the cat's face. So, what is a friend to the baby may not be quite the same as what is a friend to the cat. And again, good books appeal to adults as well as children. Losing a beloved toy, that's an experience many children will have had. Getting lost, as in Come on Daisy. And of course, the animals in these books do represent children's experiences in a kind of way, but at enough of a distance that the child can identify as much or as little as they feel like. So, the second point here, or another principle, is look at the vocabulary in the... Oh, I know, sorry, what I was going to say in relation to the first point there. In the study on long day care centres, many of the centres had books that are kind of based on TV shows and musical groups like the Wiggles. They're a kind of form of merchandising in a way. And what I noticed is that when the educators used them with children, they just didn't seem to be able to build on it or include these kinds of the depth and the richness that you get in picture books, even for babies, right of the way through. There was just a limit to what you could ask. You know, does Greg like purple? You know, what can you say? And none of those wonderful themes that children, that actually go right back into history, that idea of the journey. That's an ancient motif in literature. So, yeah, it's just the book limits the potential, I suppose. Those kinds of commercial books do limit potential for learning. So, with the idea of the rich and varied vocabulary, researchers found that you get more diverse vocabulary in picture books than in everyday conversations. That the size and diversity of children's vocabulary are associated with comprehension and background knowledge, which we have kind of discussed already. And even nursery rhymes, which are seen as rhymes for the nursery, rhymes for babies. But nursery rhymes apply, they're part of our culture. Nursery rhymes are everywhere in literature for adults as for children, in sayings, in parodies and so on and so forth. And if you just look at the kind of vocabulary in nursery rhymes, it takes us back to our history. It's interesting. It encourages children to say, what's sixpence, what's a tuffet? And so they're just so valuable as literature. And as children get older, beyond babyhood I mean, when you have different kinds of anthologies of nursery rhymes, you find it's very interesting to look at how different illustrators and artists have envisioned the meanings in nursery rhymes, because in some ways they don't have much of a meaning in a, I suppose, in a cognitive sense, but they still have meaning in different ways. So when we're choosing books, what happened then? To consider the quality and the style of the illustrations and how they support the words. And children's literature researchers have said that have explained how the illustrations and words convey meaning differently. And one group of researchers has said, or suggested, that there are 3 different kinds of relationships. So a symmetrical relationship is where the words and pictures are conveying similar meanings, but bearing in mind that they will never contain the same meanings. They will never convey the same meanings, but similar. And then enhancement is where the words and the pictures each extend the meaning of the other. So each mode is telling the story at the same time, and you can't have one without the other. And then contradiction is when the words and illustrations actually appear to be contradicting each other, which is used often in literature for older children, and it's sort of like a bit of a joke. But here are some couple of examples of what I mean. So I would see this as symmetry. This is my cap. Do I put it on like this? And often for very young children, symmetry is, the books for very young children tend to be a bit more symmetrical than books for older children. And this little book, I've read it with so many toddlers, and they find it very funny, and they can join in the joke. And so, yeah. In terms of enhancement, I love this. This is Opie and Wells, Rosemary Wells. So this is the simple nursery rhyme, Hickory Dickory Dock, the mouse ran up the clock struck 1, the mouse ran down, Hickory Dickory Dock. But look at the detail in that visual images. The humour, the cat dozing there, the mice nibbling on his supper, the mice up the top, and the cat's face on the clock. The cat's, there are sort of some intertextual references with the fiddle. Hey diddle diddle, the cat and the fiddle, and so on. And actually in this anthology of nursery rhymes, when you turn the page, there's another less well-known variant of Hickory Dickory Dock involving a plane, and I can't exactly remember it offhand, sorry. But you can see that even in an anthology where each page still references the next, so there's these interesting intertextual links you can make as well. And here's an example of contradiction in this book, Looking for Crabs. And I think this one's really interesting too, because there's the verbal text spoken by one of the children, and so and he assumes, this boy, I don't think there can be any crabs at our beach. That's the narrator, the child narrator. But the child reader reading with you can look beyond the words of the narrator, and because the pictures show there are crabs everywhere, but they're all hiding. So there's that contradiction. The pictures are contradicting the verbal text. And yeah, that for humorous effect, but also there's a lot of things you can talk about. You know, it invites questions, and it invites discussion about it and reasoning. Now, another principle is whether children can identify with the characters in the book. So that's really important for developing empathy and compassion. So here's some examples of books where the children, where you can see children from a diversity of children. And the final principle is to choose a range of books that represent diversity, culture, gender, ethnicity, age, and ability. For example, in this lovely one, The Baby's Catalogue, where you see 6 families, you follow them throughout, 5 families, you follow them throughout the day. There are all kinds of mothers doing things and all kinds of fathers doing things. It's not gendered, and so there's plenty of diversity there. And another example, which I'm not sure if you've come across, Tucker's Mob. And here there are actually 2 language and dialects, or Creole. These are just 2 photos of it. The little boy's cat follows him to school and gets sent away. The teacher encourages the little boy to write about his cat. And so we can see in the writing of the child that is written in Creole, whereas at the same time we have the standard Australian English text as well. So you're getting both language/dialects together there, side by side, showing that diversity. Oh, and sorry, there was just one more. Do the books allow children to notice print, name letters, and the sounds they make? So, sorry. So here are some examples where the print is really foregrounded, and even, you know, as you're reading, this up, as you read that, a child, even a 2-year-old, will notice there's a relationship between what they're hearing, what those little marks mean, and what you're doing with your gestures. Here's another example where the print's very diverse, and as a reader, it makes you read differently. It sort of demonstrates, and in the reader's voice, you're giving the child experience with decoding print long before they are actually going to be reading words. Here's another example with my grandson. I'd read this book to him. He's under 2. I didn't think he'd like it very much. This is The Highway Rat. But where that sister, representing the echo as it comes out of the cave, the next time we read it, he said, "That writing's wobbly." And I thought to myself, he's made that connection between my familiar voice, what he's seeing in front of him, and this making a connection there visually, which is a kind of early decoding in a way. He's starting to notice print. Okay, so let's just spend a minute looking at sharing books with babies and toddlers, because in a way babies and toddlers are a kind of a different kettle of fish to older preschoolers, and how you can work with them. Babies under 12 months, what do they do with books? You know, how do you read a book with a baby or a toddler? But again, reading with babies and toddlers has so much importance, to the point where the American Academy of Pediatrics is recommending that all parents begin reading with their child in infancy, and we also saw earlier that Australian research. So it's such an important, valuable thing that can happen in library sessions to give children these experiences that they may not, or even if they are having. It sort of gives a reason if it's needed, not that we need a reason, but it's part of the advocacy for why it's so very important with very young babies. So let's have a quick look at what babies and toddlers can learn through shared reading. These are some of the things that reading's pleasurable. The pictures in books represent objects, actions, and people. Pictures can be talked about. They relate to your own experiences, that you need to look at some parts of the picture more than others, but at the same time, all books have some things in common. So these are things babies can learn from that experience. Then let's look at what babies do with books. They look at pictures, smile, vocalise and pat. They grab them, chew them and suck them, crumple and tear the pages. and sometimes they'll attempt to turn pages. That's all totally part of a natural development. Younger toddlers, what can they do with books? Okay, so they can starting to turn pages and looking through them. They can starting to orient the book correctly, understand some familiar words. They show preference. They show individual preference for some books over others. They carry them, point to pictures, ask for names, label, and they make animal, engine and siren noises in response to pictures. So these are all things that we can use to include them and get them participating in books and reading. So older toddler books behaviours. So by the time they're 3, children, toddlers are able to interact using language to a greater degree, ask questions, pretend to read, and more make connections between what happens in a book and their own personal experiences, which is actually a key thing in encouraging love of books and reading, is to draw connections between the child and the books, the behaviours. So books for babies and toddlers, of course there's oral language, oral literature, toy books, and books that invite participation and turn-taking. That's much easier if you've got highly patterned language, and it's also easier for them to remember if it's highly patterned. And it's based on familiar relationships and objects and routines. So here are some that I'm sure you're pretty familiar with already. So this book, Where's the Baby? You lift the flap and there's the baby. This is interesting because it's bridging the gap between the child's oral experience physically and what's in a book. So it's almost bridging a gap between oral and written experience, right early on. Here's some more that are lovely. So just in the last little moments, the library context is so different in many ways, but also similar in many ways. But each library literacy session, and Amelia explained this too, has to sort of be self-contained in itself, because you don't know if you're going to have children back again or what's going to be happening. And these limitations of predictability in ages, home language experiences, different levels of familiarity, all need to be considered in planning and programming. So the factors that will shape children's engagement, and I've just started teaching as a volunteer ethics to kindergarten children at school, so I'm really, really conscious of what it's like to try and get a group and keep them going and keep them together. But this can help. What shapes children's engagement? And first of all, it's just basic. They need to see and hear clearly without having to strain, because if they have to get up and move, or else they'll get distracted, or they'll start asking their mum or carer what was said. The reader's tone of voice and responses is so important too in bringing them together as a group and maintaining their engagement. The responses of other children are influential. Their own background knowledge of vocabulary and concepts used and their life experiences. And we can build on this to help us in planning effective library sessions for children. We can, in a way, leverage off what we know about children's engagement. So I believe we're going to talk a bit more later on about the actual structure of a library literacy experience. So, and I realise the time's nearly finished, so what I'd just like to then finish up with is we'll come to that later. Is that okay, Amelia? Yeah, okay. I'm reflecting. I'm just going to move on. Sorry, we will come back. Okay, so yeah, this idea of pacing and giving time and using gestures, because to give very young children time to think about what they're seeing, they need time to, first of all, register, oh, there's a lady out there or a man out there, they're reading something, and it can be over before they've registered that this is a book. And so feel free to read it more than once, definitely. And think ahead perhaps with the kinds of questions you're going to ask. Questioning is quite and we talk about questioning quite a lot in your framework there. Why do we ask children questions during a shared reading? First of all, we encourage children to participate by asking questions, and we draw children's attention to key features of the text. And we allow children to demonstrate their knowledge by asking questions, and it gives us feedback as to where they are developmentally as well. However, the types of questions, often you read that you need to ask open-ended questions. But in the very distinctive environment of the library literacy session, if you ask open-ended questions, there's a real danger that one child will pretty much dominate the session and want to tell you about their Pokemon and, you know, what they did at Halloween and so forth. So I would suggest thinking very carefully ahead of time what kinds of questions you're going to ask, and maybe keep in mind why you're asking the questions in your context. So yes, no questions give children an opportunity to chant a response. They're participating. Specify questions: who, what, where, when questions. Several children can just offer a one-word response to that. But with the lengthy explain questions, there is that risk of one or two children dominating and the others becoming distracted. So I would simply say something like, oh, I'm really interested, but can you tell me that later? Let's get back to the story now. Or something like that, where you're not, you have something at your fingertips to manage those situations. Well, it's time for me to finish now, so thank you very much, and yeah.
I think we'll all be looking at picture books with new eyes when we get back to the library, won't we? While we've been listening to Jane, we were tweeting some of the slides and things, and people were saying, you know, will the slides be available? How are we going to find out more about this? So there are a lot of people out there who would love to know a bit more about what we've been able to share this morning. Our next presentation is from Maree, and Dr. Maree Stenglin is going to be talking about space. Not outer space, but the spaces that we all care quite intimately about are our library spaces and how they might be used.
Thank you very much, Miley. I'm just getting used to the little thing I have to press. Okay, so I'm looking at space, and I'm looking at Storytime as a journey towards literacy. And in particular, what I'd like to talk about today is some of the complexities that I've observed in relation to Storytime. I'd like to introduce a framework for thinking about Storytime, and the framework being that of the hero's journey, which comes from the work of Joseph Campbell, which I think I hope many of you are familiar with. He's one of my favourite people. And I'd like to also focus on the role of space, in particular how people use the space, the objects in the space and the activities in the space, and how that all comes together to deliver the aims of Storytime, i.e. create a community, help develop language and literacy, and also educate families. And in the process of doing that, I will introduce a few terms from my research on space and learning spaces and different kinds of spaces. And as I was preparing for this talk, I actually realised that I've been analysing space for 19 years. And I was quite surprised because I thought it was only a couple, so it's extraordinary how quickly time has passed. So occasionally here and there I will introduce a term and I will explain it to you as well. Okay, so when we started this project, not working? Oh. Sorry. That's the one I wanted. When we started this project, I actually started by reading the State Library's People Places Guide, which they published in 2012. And I was particularly interested in the 3 key recommendations for children's spaces, i.e. that they should be inspiring, that they should be comfortable, and that they should be flexible. So I kind of bore that in mind at the beginning of my own journey in working on space or library spaces for kids. And while we were in Kiama and looking at the space, one of the things that really struck me was the bridge that you can see in that space on the left-hand side. And there were 2 things that I thought was really interesting about that bridge. The first being how the children interacted with it. They just about all walked over it, and they didn't have to. They could have gone around the bridge, but they chose not to. They actually chose to walk over that, and that was a really important part of their experience of entering into the children's space. And the second thing about that was it got me started in terms of thinking about Storytime as a journey. And that in turn drew me to the work of Joseph Campbell, who was a professor of literature in the States, and he spent his life looking and studying comparative mythology, so the stories from all the different cultures around the world. And as part of his work, he came up with the hero's journey framework, in which he talks about the journey of the hero in 3 stages. In the first stage, the hero separates from their everyday world. They pass a threshold and then they move into a stage which he calls initiation, where they're faced with a whole lot of obstacles, trials and tribulations and things that they have to overcome. In the process of meeting those challenges and overcoming those challenges, there's often some sort of revelation that happens. And then in the end of that stage, they have a life-enhancing return back to the everyday world where they started, the known world from which they set forth. And when I started thinking about Storytime, I thought about the journey of the child, and I liked the idea of the child going on a journey because it's also in keeping with the principle that Amelia espoused in the opening, that in our framework we really like to foreground the child and think about the child's experience. So on this journey, the journey for the child begins in the everyday world, in the home, in the place where they feel safe and secure, where they're surrounded by things that are familiar to them, like their toys, and where they are very much a part of the spaces that influence and form their everyday lives, including little nooks and crannies that they like to hide into, escape and play in. So that's where the story begins for the child. And in this world, they receive a call to adventure from a trusted carer, often mum, sometimes grandparents, sometimes nannies, and saying, okay, it's time to get ready for story time. And so they're initiating the adventure. And then the child then responds, and they either respond with acceptance of the call or they respond with refusal. And those of you who've taken children to Storytime, I think you've probably been met with both of those. And the refusal obviously needs a little bit of reassurance, love and support and coaxing to get the child to leave the familiar world of their everyday play spaces behind them and begin the journey. And with their trusted carer by their side, they leave home and they enter into the world of the library. And this involves them in passing their first challenge, which is crossing over the threshold. And as they approach the library, the first threshold is actually the entrance, which can be daunting to a small child. And then they move through the security screens, which can also be a little bit daunting to the child. And after that, they proceed with their caregiver towards the second threshold that they need to pass. And the second threshold is, for many, a seamless transition. They just sort of move into the children's space. But in some libraries, it's much more than that. It's actually made a bit more special. So at Sutherland Library, which is on the left-hand side, it's a transitional thing where they walk through an opening that feels like and looks like a cave, and then they are received into the space. And in the second one from Kiama, obviously they're walking across a bridge, and then after they get off the bridge, they have arrived in the space. Now, if we're thinking about inspiring spaces, as the State Library document suggested, I think there's something really special about that arrival into the children's space. And I think sort of flagging that threshold in this way is quite a nice way to start their real adventure, which is they're moving into the space where Storytime will actually begin. And I'm making a note of that, or a point of that, because many of you, and I don't know to what degree you do get involved in the design of library spaces, but many new libraries are being built. And if you are involved in the design, these may be a couple of ideas that you might want to throw around and think about with your colleagues and the architect who's designing the spaces. But anyway, once they've passed the second threshold, they have arrived. They're received into the space and the real adventure begins for them. Okay. Now, the very first question that I ask is that the People and Spaces document recommends that the spaces for children should feel comfortable. So that's the first question I would ask. How do they then feel in that space, the children's space that they've arrived in? And it's an important consideration because the way a space closes in on the user or opens up around the user can trigger feelings of security or insecurity. And what we'd hope for is that once they're in the space, they're going to feel very comfortable and very relaxed and very safe and secure. And in my work on space, I use the term bound to capture that feeling of feeling protected, at ease, at home in a particular space. And I think that feeling was captured really nicely in a quote that I found on the Kiama Library's website, or I don't know, I was sort of looking around, and one of the users wrote, "It's a welcoming place, like a second home." And I think that's the kind of feeling that we would want the child to have when they come into the library space. Now, when they come to us from home, they also carry with us their baselines for security, and those are established in their familiar world and their familiar environment in which they live. And domestic spaces are scaled, they use a scale called human scale. So it's not very far for a person to reach the ceiling, for example. Ceilings don't tower over us, they're actually quite close. You can step on a chair and reach the ceiling. So there's a human scale to our spaces. Another thing that makes the domestic space feel very comfortable and warm and secure, different nooks and crannies that the space might have. So corners, for example, are a really beautiful choice for enclosure. Once you're in a corner, you feel very safe. And one of the things that I noticed looking at how people interact with museum spaces is if it's a very large exhibition space and there's text and pictures on the wall and they feel it's quite exposed in that space, they will tend to gravitate towards a corner where there may be a text panel or something that they can read carefully and peacefully, because it does provide them that sense of enclosure behind them. The other thing with children's spaces that they often like are spaces that are scaled to their height. So the cubby is a great place to go in because it doesn't tower over them. It envelops around them really nicely. It's like a womb-like space, and so they feel very comfortable in those spaces. And one of the things that I've noticed in recent trends in library design, particularly children's library spaces, is a shift or a movement towards creating more bound spaces for children, spaces where they feel more comfortable. And on the first slide, that's Concord Library, and the thing that's making that space feel really bound is not the actual height of the ceiling, because the ceiling's actually quite tall, but it's having that wall in front of the space that the architects have brought down a bit, so it suggests there's an enclosure, so it feels much more enclosing, much more safe, much more secure as a space. And there's also, you can see that the walls around it with the books, the shelves with the books, are creating a really firm enclosure as well. So that's creating a really lovely, comfortable, secure, warm space for the child to go into. The other things that are featuring very prominently are these reading pods, and this one's from Green Square Library, which opened not last Saturday but the Saturday before. And Green Square Library has them, Double Bay Library has them as well. So little pods, womb-like spaces almost, where the child can go and read. And it's not just the child. I've often seen parents going in there with a child and they sort of curl up around there with a book, and it's quite a comfortable, secure nook. They're removed from the activities of that are going around them, and they've got a nice safe place where they can sit and read in peace. Now, the interesting thing about bound spaces is that they tend to suit certain types of activities. They're really great for, they still us, they calm us down, they sort of are very stilling spaces. One of my colleagues used to call them shh spaces, okay, so they're classic contemplative spaces. And in museums in particular, people often whisper in bound spaces because there's this sense that you have to be very quiet. And from an activity point of view, they inspire activities or suit activities like reading, contemplation, listening, drawing, writing. They're great spaces for doing those sorts of things. And the other thing about space is that there's another choice for security, and that is what I call the unbound space. And in an unbound space, the enclosures are loosened. The walls are pushed back, so you get much more of a large space, more open plan kind of feeling. Ceilings go up a little bit, but not too high. And so you've got a big sort of openness, a much more open volume of space around the occupant. Window walls come in, so plate glass window walls enclosing spaces come in, and that means that there's more light in the space, there's more connection between the interior and the exterior world, and it's a much more open feeling. But one of the problems can be that unless they're really well designed, they can also be really hot. And that's something that Amelia and I found when we were at the launch of the Green Square Library the other day. We were there very early in the morning. It wasn't hot at that point, and we were in the coffee shop, which I'll show you in a minute, and we felt incredibly hot. And the thing about feeling very hot in a space is that thermally you don't feel comfortable, and therefore it inspires you to leave. So glass can be a double-edged sword. It needs to be very well designed. And speaking of Green Square Library, there is a really big trend towards unbinding in terms of design of library spaces. So this is Green Square. You can see this is the entrance to the library, a very, very large volume of space, a lot of glass, very, very tall ceilings, and this is the area for the coffee shop. So the entrance into the library is into a very large coffee shop, and I assume that the thinking for that is that you can bring people into the library just for a cup of coffee. You don't have to sort of do anything else, but hopefully you will entice them into later spaces. And I haven't spoken to the architects, I don't know, but that's the feeling that I get from, this particular design. And the other space is in something called the tower. So the tower's behind the coffee shop area, a little bit removed back. So once you enter into the space, you go down the stairs into the library, which is underground and bound, very bound space. And there's a beautiful circular garden in that space. And then as you move through that space towards the end, there's a tower. And the tower's, I think, 5 stories high. And this is a reading room that's located in that tower. And you can see that it's very different to the children's reading nook that we looked at a few slides ago. It's very, very unbound, and it's very much oriented towards looking into the outside urban environment. Now, the trend to unbinding in libraries isn't new. Just as it isn't in museums, it's been going for a long time. And we can see Concord Library, which also has big plate glass walls, and that opened, I think, in 2008. And Kiama Library also has a beautiful big plate glass wall, and they opened in 2010. And both of them, the choice of the plate glass window wall was to connect the library to the urban environment. And in the case of Kiama, it was about building the library around a tree, an old Moreton Bay fig that had been there for a very, very long time. So the design of the library is like a tree house. So you have a sense you're walking up ramps and you're going into a tree house and circling around it as you move into the actual library spaces. So it's about connecting the community to one of the local icons, if you like, an old tree. And like bound spaces, unbound spaces suit different types of activities. They free us. They open us up for action and interaction. And people behave very differently in unbound spaces. They don't whisper anymore. They tend to laugh, they talk loudly, sometimes they shout, they feel very relaxed, they're very free to sort of express themselves. And from a learning perspective, they suit hands-on learning for a lot of children, running around, exploring, very activity-based learning tends to happen in the unbound spaces. In aquaria, you'll have your touch pools in unbound spaces, that kind of thing. And this is great in a library for a craft space where you're doing hands-on activities with the children, but not so great, for example, if you want to create a really contemplative environment for shared group reading. Okay, that can be a really big problem. Okay, so just very briefly, I'm going to mention two of the other choices for spatial enclosure that I've worked on. And these evoke insecurity, strong feelings of insecurity. So there's the two-bound space in the natural environment, that's the cave, where there's not a lot of space around you. It's really dark and gloomy, as in the snail picture book story that Jane just read us. And you feel quite claustrophobic in that space. So an elevator in the built environment, a tunnel, an adult in that cubby house. When I go into that cubby house, I feel it's very oppressive. I can't wait to get out because I can't stand up, I can't stretch, I can't do many things. So it doesn't feel comfortable or secure to me. So that's the two-bound dimension. And at the other extreme, you have the two unbound. And in the natural environment, that's the cliff. You're standing at the edge of a cliff and the base plane under you drops away, and that evokes a very strong feeling of fear and insecurity. In the built environment, skyscrapers are a great example of that. Particularly the higher you go, the more removed you are from the ground, and the more kind of exposed and vulnerable one tends to feel in the space. And I have to say, and I don't know whether other people share my feelings at all, but when I went up into the tower spaces at Green Square the other Saturday, once I started getting to level 5, which I think was the music room or the anything goes room, I'm not entirely sure, but once I started getting up higher and higher into the tower, I did start to feel a little bit it did start to feel oppressive to me. And it didn't have a balcony around it, which often units in skyscrapers have, where you feel like there's a little bit of something outside that's protecting me. This was just sheer glass. And I really didn't feel, personally, I didn't feel great, but I would be interested to see how other people feel in the upper levels of the tower. But anyway, I don't want to talk about spatial insecurity today. I'd like to focus on making people feel, comfortable and bound and secure. So one of the other things that tends to happen in custom designed libraries is that often, particularly if Storytime is large in your library, the architects will design a very big space for you to work in so that you can fit in the 40 children and the 40 carers, or the 60 children and the 60 carers. So they're creating a very large volume of space for you to work in when you're doing a Storytime. And a very large space can make people feel insecure because there's a lot of there's a large volume of space opening up around you. So one of the strategies for making that feel like a more secure environment, and this is something that I've noticed that you do, and this is Coffs Harbour Library, is you put down a beautiful, colourful rug. Now, the rug has an important function in terms of spatial security in the space because it creates a space within a space, and it's the kind of principle that people who live in warehouses often use. They have a rug where the dining area is, another rug where the lounge room is, and so on and so forth. So you're actually breaking down the volume of space very simply, very flexibly, very portably, but very effectively as well. The other thing you're doing with the rug is you're delineating. This is the space where Storytime happens. This is where you sit to the child that's come into the library. So you're making that space very visible. And it does create that sense of, it suggests that sense of enclosure, even though it doesn't have, walls around it, so to speak. And the other thing it does in mythological terms, it creates almost like a magic carpet where the children sit, and then in the reading of the book and with the engagement of the storyline, they're being taken to faraway places and faraway lands and experiencing adventures with characters and living in vicarious worlds. So it does have mythologically quite an interesting and inspiring feel or dimension to it as well. Now, the other thing I noticed about how people use spaces, and this is talking to flexibility in terms of the initial opening that I made, is that people tend to, or librarians tend to, not only put the rug down, but they also put down objects like cushions in the Storytime space. And so the cushions, I think, serve a really important function for a child, especially a child who's a newcomer to the library, because they're the kinds of things, they're colourful, they're inviting, they're the kinds of things they have in their domestic worlds, in their home, in the spaces that they've just left behind. And so you're creating a sense of an inviting, welcoming, warm environment, and very, very flexibly. It doesn't have to be, it's not a big thing that you do, but you put out the colourful cushions and it's a very warm, welcoming, spatial welcome for the child coming into that particular space. The other thing that a lot of librarians do to make their spaces more welcoming is put out a lot of soft toys. And that's also, a similar kind of gesture. It's a welcoming gesture. It's bridging the domestic environment with the institutional environment. So when you come in, there are soft, cuddly toys that they can relate to, that they can hug, that they can carry around, and they feel at home with those. They give them an additional sense of security in the institutional space of a library, particularly if it's the first time they've ever been taken into a library. And a lot of children do carry them around and they do attach to them. And in one library, I think it was at Kiama, there was a beach ball that was put out at the beginning of the session. And there was a little boy who came for the very first time. His name was Lewis. And Lewis attached to this yellow beach ball. And he just picked it up and he carried it around for the entire session. He didn't sit on the rug. He didn't do anything. He just was exploring his environment, but holding on securely to this beach ball. And the librarian who was running the session was just wonderful. She kept saying to the mother, "Don't worry, everything's fine. He's just got the ball and he can hear us, he can hear everything that we're saying, he can hear the songs, he can hear all the conversations that we're having, but he's just using this ball as a prop and he's using it as a security blanket in this new space that's unfamiliar to him. And over time, he will learn to, join us on the rug and sit down and participate in story time. But this was like a bridging thing for him and a very, very important sort of prop or object that, he was able to attach to in that space. Now, in terms of spatial security, there's nothing quite like a hug. Okay, so hugs are very, very reassuring for children, especially with caregivers. And that brings me to another bridging resource that librarians have at their disposal and that you all use, most of you use very, very skillfully, and that is the way that you position the chairs in the space. So once you've established the rug, once the rug's gone down, the chairs in the space tend to be put around that rug. They encircle the rug. So what that means is that the carer is very close by, but also when the child's sitting on that rug, particularly if it's a big space, those chairs are creating a sense of enclosure around the child and around the rug and around the storytime space. And to me, it's very, very analogous to a spatial hug. There's a spatial hug that's happening that's helping that child feel more secure. And I think that the other important dimension of that is that the adult is never far away from them if they're sitting on the rug. They don't have to travel far to get to mum or dad or grandma or nanny for a hug and reassurance if they need to. And that brings me to the other challenge of the storytime space. The journey from the lap to the rug is a really big challenge for the child because the lap is that locus of security where they're with mum and they feel really safe. But what we really want them to do is to be able to let go of that and to transition towards the rug, because once they've sat on the rug, they've joined the group, they've joined the library community, and they've become part of that group learning experience that Jane and Amelia have both talked so much about. And when they're on that rug, lots of challenges that they face about how to behave, about listening, about asking questions, answering questions, not calling out, all sorts of different things that are really important social skills that they're learning and that will also prepare them beautifully for when they go to the school, because once they're at school, they'll be sitting on that rug alone and there won't be a mummy or daddy nearby in terms of a spatial hug. So it's a very important apprenticing experience, I think, in terms of school readiness as well, and learning the kinds of group behaviours that they need to engage in to become part of a social group. Now, going back to unbinding, another dimension of unbinding for a minute, is that one of the things about unbinding having big, large window walls is that they create a lot of glare. It's very, very hard to look into the glare oftentimes, particularly if sunlight's streaming through. And so that makes story time a really hard thing to do. But one of the things that I'm noticing, or I have noticed time and time again, is how flexible you are in the way that you organise and position your space. So what this librarian has done is she simply turned the students or the children's backs to the glary window wall, so they're not facing that, and instead they're facing into a bound wall, a much easier thing for them to, in terms of focus, in terms of concentration, and she's taken the glare on herself, so she's the one facing the window wall, and in that way she's created a much more bound environment for children where they can focus and learning becomes a whole lot easier. Another example of unbinding is distraction. So on the left-hand side, we have Sutherland Library, which was a very interesting space, as I said, the cave space, and then you sort of come into the cave space, and on the right is the Storytime space. And when I walked into that space for the first time, I looked at that window wall and I thought, oh my gosh, what are they going to do with that? Because not only is it a large window that goes from floor to ceiling, but it's the major walkway into the library. So you've got people walking up and down and past there all the time. And I thought, how will someone run a storytime session in that space? And I can see where the rug is, I can see where the presenter's going to be sitting, and I'm looking at this space going, wow, it's going to be so distracting. Anyway, needless to say, you guys are amazing. So within minutes before the session actually began, the presenter walked over to that window wall and pulled down the blind, as you can see. Very flexible solution to a very big problem. And by doing that, very simply created a bound space that suited contemplation, reading, and gave her prominence in terms of the group and everybody seeing her and being able to focus and concentrate on her in the space. This one is an interesting one. So this is also a relatively new library, East Maitland Library. And for me, this was, I experienced this as a very, very bound space, like too bound almost. It's like being in a fishbowl. Because what you can see happening in this space is the major walkway into the library. You can see people walking past. You can see the security monitors. Sorry, I've got a pointer here, I just realised. Security monitors, people walking up and down. And not only are they walking up and down, as I sort of mentioned with the Sutherland Library, but there's no window or wall that's shielding them here. So that means that the noise, they're chatting, they're talking, they're conversing, that noise is carrying through into the space as well. So from my perspective, and also surveillance, whoever's walking past can look in on the group. So there's that dimension to it as well. So I thought, when I looked at that, I thought, good heavens, that's a really difficult space. And yet it's a new space. It's just recently been designed. So therefore, one of the things that you really need to think about if you have, and I don't know how much say you have into the design of your spaces, but there's a concept that architects work with that's called adjacency. So what you put next to each other is actually really important. And if you do see the plans, they're hard to understand often. I understand that as well. But if you do get any input, think about the adjacencies. Will there be, what sort of enclosure will there be in terms of the Storytime space? And will there be someone walking past? And if so, who and why? And these are the kinds of important considerations that you need to make, particularly for new spaces. And I'm gathering too that this red colour, which I find, it's quite a stimulating colour, I'm sort of thinking that was probably a move towards making an inspiring space. And it can be, but the problem is the adjacency here, particularly for Storytime, where you need them focused and concentrating on the book. But once again, an amazing example of flexibility and ingenuity. The presenter in this session did the only thing that she could do. She created a really bound little environment by manipulating the only element she had at her disposal, which was the positioning of herself and the children. So she brought herself down to their level, sat on the floor, brought them in around her, and she created a hub in the middle of that space so that they could concentrate on the book and see the book, and they weren't distracted by the noises and all the activity that was happening behind them. So even in a situation that seems really, really difficult, there are still things that can be done and that you do incredibly flexibly. It's a classic example of thinking outside the square box of the space to find a really creative solution for a storytime session. In terms of people in space, the numbers of people that you have in a space will also impact on security, and I'm sure you already know that. If you've got a really bound, enclosing sort of space like we can see here, and you've only got 3 mums and 3 babies in the space, you've got a wonderful opportunity for an intimate encounter. You can sit on the rug with them, you can talk to them, you can be at eye level with them, everyone feels comfortable and secure, and it's very easy to have a really beautiful storytime session with that group. However, if you have that space and you have 20 children and 20 mums or carers going into that space, then you have a very different situation. So then you've got something that's going to feel much more like being in a sardine can. So the way that this librarian managed that, and very skillfully, was she positioned herself very high in the space so that everybody could see her, which was something that Jane talked about as being really important. She also didn't put chairs right around the rug because that would take up too much room. So the parents were sitting on the floor, resting on the bookshelf, and in that way she managed to fit as many people into that space as she could. Admittedly, that was not a custom designed space for Storytime. It was an older library. I believe it's being redesigned. So the Storytime space will be changing. It's at Wallandilly. But again, a creative use of the space. And one of the advantages of that, because you always have to look at the positive, don't you? Very important. So one of the advantages of this is, even though we're in a sardine can, the gap between the lap and the rug has been minimised. Even situations like this can have really amazing and wonderful outcomes. But that is something you have to balance in the design of new library spaces. The number of people that are attending the program and the volume of space that you're going to get. And is there some flexible solution? Would it be possible perhaps, and I'm sort of thinking laterally, but to have shelves on casters that you could sort of move in to create a more bound space if it's a small group, and maybe move out to create more unbound space. They're the kinds of sort of suggestions or ideas that sort of came to my mind looking at that particular space. So to recap the journey so far, I find it really not just reassuring, but I really commend you in the way that you work with the spaces, the way you occupy them, the way you design them, the way you turn them around to your advantage, the kinds of flexibility that you use to create really comfortable and reassuring and welcoming spaces for children. I think you're doing an amazing job. And it's very, very important for the child that it does actually feel really comfortable in that space. And I also really love the way that cushions and toys and props are brought in, particularly for little children or for newcomers, to kind of help ease that transition into an institutional space that they may not be accustomed to. And just to recap, that the bound space is the conceptual space where we do a lot of our thinking and listening and reading, and the unbound space is the one that's more oriented to activities. Okay, so in terms of the hero's journey, our wonderful heroes are now moving into the initiation. They've been received into the space, a wonderful space that you have made as comfortable and welcoming as you possibly can for them, and as conducive as you possibly can to the kinds of things that they have to do in Storytime, particularly listening, which is very hard. And I commend you today for listening for as long as you have been, because that's also a very difficult thing to be doing. So you've created an amazingly wonderful bound space. And the next step in the journey involves the hero meeting the guide. And the guide is each and every one of you. I know that you don't like to be called teachers, but perhaps guide is a term that sits more comfortably with you, because you are your protective figure. You welcome them, you introduce yourself to them, you make eye contact with them, you smile with them, you ask them their name, you tell them your name, and you establish a connection with them in some way, and then you are their guide for the entire Storytime session, and that's a really important role that you fulfil. It's a very complex role, so in addition to setting up the space and welcoming those participants, there are a lot of things you need to do. You have already selected the songs, the books, the rhymes, and the craft activities. You need to lead that group from the front of the space. You need to introduce each song, model the actions that you want them performing. You need to praise the group, or you do praise the group, and you manage those transitions from one activity to another. You distribute the musical instruments and collect them, and that's not a minor thing, particularly if there are 40 or 60 children in the group. Okay, that's a very big thing that you're doing. You're sharing tips on literacy with caregivers, and you're giving craft instructions, distributing materials, overseeing the craft, and then tidying it all up at the end. And I hope you go and have a really nice cup of tea or coffee when you've finished. Okay, but that's not all you do. You do more than that. You also manage the props. And in storytelling, they could be puppets that you use for oral storytelling, or they could be felt boards, because they seem to feature very prominently in the library story times that I've been fortunate enough to see. And you also manage the instruments, and you need to think, or you do think very carefully about when to make them available. In this particular session at Kiama, the instruments were put out at the beginning of the session for kids to play with when they entered the space, and they could sort of pick them up and run around with them if they wanted to, so they were a welcoming gesture. But most often I saw them used in the session in terms of being shaken to the beat of the song, so that you're using them during the singing. And sometimes they're used after if there's one-to-one reading with parent and child, where the group disperses, and then it's a nice way of bringing the group back into oneness again. And with the musical instruments, you're doing much, 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 much more than simply filling in time and having a bit of fun with the kids. You're basically using those instruments to create a sense of cohesion, oneness, solidarity, bonding, and a sense of belonging. Simply put, those instruments are bringing that group together, and they're aligning the group into a whole in much the same way that a Mexican wave does. So you're creating that unity within that group. You're joining all those disparate individuals who have come from all those different homes in that local area, and you're binding them into one whole. And in that way, you're actually fulfilling that aim of building a community of library users. It's community building, it's bonding, and it's a really important thing that you're doing. So if anyone has anything negative to say about them, you're actually doing something that's an incredibly important thing. Now, the other activity that you manage a lot is singing. There's a lot of singing in Storytime. And singing often happens at the beginning of the session, and it's a very, very prominent feature of the warm-up. You have familiar songs that you sing with the group each week, and the children get to know them and they anticipate them, and they know that once they hear that song, Storytime has begun. So if they're not on the rug, they know that they need to come to the rug. You also use them in really interesting ways to manage the group. So if the group is not cohesive and it's not functioning and things are not working and they're restless and they're very unsettled, you tend to sing a song. And the song that you like to sing is Twinkle Twinkle. Most of you use that one as a really calming, soothing song that always sort of seems to calm the group down. So again, singing is playing a very major role in terms of creating a community and cohesiveness in your group. And if the group is restless, if it's a really windy day outside and kids tend to get really stirred up, you again use a song to expend energy, something like Row, Row, Row Your Boat. Okay, that seems to be a really good one. And not only are they singing Row, Row, Row Your Boat, they're also going, you also have the actions that are happening. And once again, that Mexican wave is happening, and that group is coming together in oneness as a whole. And at the end of the session, we sing a song again, a wrap-up song, a goodbye song, a song that signals that Storytime has come to an end this week. And it's, again, another one of those familiar elements. It's part of the routine. They expect it. They know that it's coming. And over time, they really get to know it, and they can participate more and more fully in the singing of that song. And once again, singing in the ways in which you use it is an extremely important means of having fun with the group. But again, it's so much more. It's so much more that you're doing. One of the things that you're doing that's very important is developing their language and literacy in a whole lot of ways. So first of all, you're helping children to learn the rhythmic and melodic patterns of the language. And when those rhythmic and melodic patterns of spoken language that we actually have, when they're set to music and when they're repeated time and time and time again and we sing them, what happens is that we internalise them. They become embodied, and that's what you're doing with the songs that you're singing. And when I used to teach second language learners, one of the things that we had to teach were those intonation patterns, and it's actually really, really hard. And so I used to use a series of chants, and I used to get them clicking their fingers to the beat of the chant, and then we'd walk around the room to the rhythm of the language, and that's what I was teaching them, and that's what you're teaching the children when they're singing songs as well. You're also supporting their vocabulary learning, as Jane mentioned, and their communication skills and also their listening skills. After you've sung the first verse of Row, Row, Row Your Boat, as they're learning a song, they know what's coming up next, and so they can participate, and so they need to listen as well. And so all of that's happening hand in hand. And you're developing their phonological and phonemic awareness, kookaburra sits in the old gum tree and so on. So they're learning how to segment words and how to break them down into parts, and sometimes you're clapping to them, sometimes you're using the shakers to develop that awareness. There's an awful lot that you're doing in terms of aiding their language and literacy development. The other thing that you're doing is you're creating a really positive predisposition to learning. When I look at the children in your groups, when they're singing, they're often smiling, they're having a really good time, they're really enjoying the song, there's a really lovely atmosphere in the room. You're developing their confidence in their capacity to participate, particularly if they come time and time again, because they are learning those words, and this week they can sing all the words to Row, Row, Row Your Boat, and that's such a great feeling, and they can actually participate in that group. And you are developing that appreciation that learning is fun, and as Amelia and Jane have both said, do not underestimate the value of that in terms of the lifelong implications that it's going to have for that child. That positive predisposition is a really, really fundamentally important part of the learning that's happening in your library storytime sessions. And once again, you're building a community because you're all singing together. You're all saying exactly the same words, and you're all making the same gestures. And that's that. Oh, sorry. Does it still work? Oh, God. Okay, sorry. I use my hands a lot, obviously. You're creating that Mexican wave phenomena. And there's also a really lovely thing that I observe at the end of the songs, and that's a clapping. And no matter what happens, everybody claps together at the end of the song and people say, yay! And occasionally when the librarian is too busy to do it, or they're so focused on what's coming next and they don't do it, I've seen the mums step in and do it for you, or sometimes even the children. The children will get up and they will spontaneously start going, yay, and clapping at the end of the song. So there's that beautiful sense of appreciation of everyone coming together in the most positive, wonderful way as a community. Sorry, I'm not the right person to put in front of a microphone. Okay. And in terms of the literacy and language benefits of singing, for example, I just went very quickly to the literature review that we've been talking about, which I believe is available online from the State Library's website. So if you ever do need to explain to people what are the literacy benefits of the activities that you do, we did very much focus on those, particularly in section 6, Public Libraries as Early Literacy Environments, and there's a section on singing, not just singing, but singing and nursery rhymes. And so the things that I've mentioned to you, you can actually go there, read about them. We didn't write very long sections for those bits. We tried to keep it quite short because we know that time is of the essence, but we did make it very research-based. So there are other references in there. We cite the latest research, and if you want to, if something's not clear, you can always go and look that up for yourselves and pursue it further, or if something interests you and you want to find out a little bit more about it, that's a nice sort of scaffolding and supportive way, I think, that you can then take that initiative and find out more. I need to see how I'm going for time. Okay. But the most important object in the Storytime session is the book. And as we all know, the book is the gateway to literacy. So that's really the most important object that you work with in your Storytime session. And we've heard a lot today about the importance of comprehension in terms of, helping children understand the story, understand what's going on, and how important understanding keywords are, particularly keywords in the book, and particularly if you think those words are going to be unusual words. They're not everyday words that children hear in their normal lives. And drawing on background knowledge or building up shared knowledge to help them understand the story that will be unfolding, that you will be reading to them. And I personally am an advocate, very strong advocate of the thematic approach, because it means once you've built up shared vocabulary, once you've built up a shared background, you can then draw across that in your songs, in your rhymes, in the books, and everything sort of working together cohesively for you. So I think a thematic approach has a lot to offer, Storytime presenters, particularly when you're planning a session. In this particular instance, in terms of preparing them for reading, this Storytime reading came from a firefighter theme. And this librarian was absolutely amazing because she actually dressed up as a firefighter and sort of came out and said, the theme for today is firefighters, and I'm wearing a hat, and I'm wearing boots, and I'm wearing a red firefighter shirt. And that's how the session started. So she started talking about firefighters and who they are, how they dress, what they do, and so on. And when it got to the part in the session where they were going to read a book, she said to them, I'm going to read you a book in a minute, but before I do that, I'd really like to have a conversation with you about fire safety. And then she talked to them about the things that they needed to know that were going to be important for them in terms of the understandings in the book that they were about to meet in 5 or 10 minutes' time. And one of the lovely things that she did was, in the course of that conversation, the word panic came up. When there's a fire, people panic. And she said to them, do you know what the word panic means? Would you like me to show you what panic means? And it was just beautiful. And then she acted out panic for them. And it was a really, really lovely way of bridging them into the kinds of meanings, the vocabulary that they were going to meet in the book. Beautiful. Lovely way to facilitate comprehension. Now, another session that we saw and that we've been looking at in terms of preparing them for reading, a lovely way to prepare them for reading was with a puppet. So this is Liz, who's in the audience, and she was preparing them for the pirate theme, and the puppet is Pirate Pete. And she used Pirate Pete in many really amazing ways. He was a very shy pirate, and he couldn't talk to the group, but he would talk to her. And that was lovely because it established a really beautiful sense of empathy for the shy kids in the audience. They could relate to that. And she used him initially to teach the children pirate language. So, ahoy me hearties, and lots of other wonderful things. And then later, after the Pirate Pete section, she also wanted to teach them some of the vocabulary associated with ships, because in the pirate stories there were going to be tall ships, there were going to be things like rigging, and it's highly likely that they haven't heard or seen those things and don't know what they are. And so Liz did something really wonderful, and she brought a non-fiction book into the Storytime session and said, I'd like to show you some pictures, and in that way showed them what a tall ship was and showed them what rigging was. And, we hadn't seen that done before, so it was a really nice way of integrating non-fiction into the session in order to kind of prepare them for the reading that was going to come. And Liz will be talking more about that in the panel session afterwards, so I won't say too much more than that. Another lovely way of introducing a theme was Susan Forshaw, who's also in the audience today and will be speaking in the panel. And Susan's theme for the week was mice. And one of the things that she did to create engagement, we've talked a lot about the importance of engagement today, to create a sense of engagement and stimulate curiosity and really inspire them to engage with her. 2 minutes, okay. Ooh. Okay, she had a puppet in a crate. And she had them guessing what the puppet was. So in the first picture, she was saying, it has whiskers and then a tall, a long tail, and so on and so forth. And she acted out, once they'd guessed that it was a mouse, and she was acting out different behaviours like nibble and squeak, 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 squeak with the puppet. And these are words that they would be hearing later in the book. So it was a hook to the book as well. And the lovely thing was that the puppet sort of dropped off, but during the reading, when the word squeak came up, she was able to still do that gesture to remind them of the meaning that they had shared and that she had built up with them. And the same with nibble. She was able to make that gesture and do the same sort of thing again. And so again, a really powerful way of bridging them into the actual book. Okay, very briefly, the final stage of the hero's journey, the journey of our wonderful heroes, is when they have to go home. And, sorry. And one of the things that was happening afterwards, after Susan had done all that work, sort of pre-teaching them the vocabulary to do with mice, is that you can see when the reading was happening, they were really engaged because they were able to understand, they were able to access, and they were able to comprehend. So it had a really positive effect on the kind of interaction that the children had with the book. The last stage of the hero's journey, the hero returns home, and hopefully with a boon. And the boon can be an object, and the object that we want is the book, because we want them taking what they've learnt back into their home environment where they started their journey in the morning, and continuing to engage with books and the reading practices that, you know, we're fostering a love of in the library environment. And we also hope they're coming with a bit of a changed consciousness towards literacy. So feeling happy, they've had fun, a sense of belonging, they're part of a community, a sense of love of listening to books or interacting with books or lifting flaps and looking at them. And that the caregivers are also coming home with a really positive predisposition towards what's just happened and what they've learnt. Like, my child's developing, you know, phonemic awareness, print awareness, and this is important because, and at home I can do this to develop these skills even further. So the kinds of knowledge and tips that you share with them then get carried hopefully forward into the home environment. And the key to this bond is borrowing. So we want them borrowing at the end of the session. And that is once again where Susan again put it really beautifully, during her interview. And she said the connection between the library and the child is established and maintained through the activity of borrowing. So that is the kind of final kind of thing that we want at the end of the hero's journey before they leave the library and go back into their spaces. And again, that relationship with the guide is really pivotal in establishing that. So again, it's really wonderful to see the way that you don't just pack up after craft and disappear for your cup of tea. You actually stay in the library and you talk to the kids and you get to know them and you talk to the families and you say, I know, you know, Susie loved Eric Carle's Hungry Caterpillar. We've got another Eric Carle book. I think she's going to really enjoy that. And so you encourage and you direct their reading and, you know, you sort of foster that love of learning and you try and take it back into, foster that to happen back into the home environment. The craft is another boon that they carry back into the home. And at the end of the session, when they go home and they leave with that little bit of craft, it's wonderful for the mums and dads that weren't present at the story time, because it's something that they bring home and they can actually look at and start a conversation with them about. So what did you do at story time today? Oh, you made this. And then they can start asking questions about what actually happened. So it gives them a shared context in the home for still continuing the seeds that you have sown in your story time session. And I think I'll just end here, but one of the final points I want to make is that in terms of writing all this up for the framework, I did write it all up, but I decided not to write it up as a hero's journey because I wasn't sure how many people are familiar with that. I decided not to write this information up using my theoretical terms of binding and bonding because, again, I don't know how familiar people are with that, and probably not at all. So what I did instead was use a question and answer approach to talk about all these things. So it's in section 5.2 of your framework called Frequently Asked Questions and Answers. So questions like, what strategies can we use to introduce the theme of the session? What are some ideas for warming up a group? How can we best organise a children's storytime space, and so on and so forth? And I'm hoping that that will be really powerful for you and useful and helpful. And I think I might leave it there. I've just thrown in a few references because I didn't include Joseph Campbell in the framework, nor have I referenced my own work. And that's it. We've made it. It's lunchtime. Thank you so much.
It's like Fight Club, isn't it? What happens in the Metcalfe stays in the Metcalfe. Okay, we're breaking for lunch now. We do need to be back here at 1:35, so lunch is in the room you in for morning tea behind us. Thank you.